At the end of the Ice Age, climate instability reshaped the landscapes of Upper Mesopotamia. 12,000 years before the first cities of Mesopotamia, Southwest Asia stood at the edge of climatic transformation. Between approximately 20,000 and 11,700 BCE, during the final millennia of the late Pleistocene, global temperatures fluctuated sharply as the planet transitioned out of the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets that had dominated northern latitudes began retreating, but this warming trend was neither uniform nor stable. Paleoclimatic records indicate a sequence of oscillations that directly affected rainfall patterns, vegetation cover, and animal migration routes across the Near East. Sediment cores extracted from Lake Van in eastern Anatolia demonstrate alternating wet and arid phases during this period. Pollen analysis reveals shifts between steppe vegetation and more wooded environments, indicating unstable precipitation regimes. Speleothem data from caves in southeastern Anatolia confirm abrupt temperature reversals during the Younger Dryas, dated approximately 10,900 to 9,700 BCE. This cold and dry interval temporarily halted post-glacial warming. Records indicate a significant contraction of forested zones and a reduction in reliable plant productivity during these centuries. The region later known as the Fertile Crescent, extending from the Levant through northern Mesopotamia, contained diverse ecological corridors. Wild einkorn wheat and barley grew naturally in upland zones, particularly around the Karakatag Range. Pistachio woodlands and almond trees dotted transitional zones between steppe and forest. Herds of gazelle, along with aurochs and wild boar, migrated seasonally across plains and river valleys. This ecological mosaic provided opportunity, but not permanence. Resources were abundant at certain times of year and scarce in others. The site now called Göbekli Tepe lies near modern Sanliurfa in southeastern Turkey, positioned on a limestone ridge overlooking the Harran Plain. During the late Pleistocene, this location occupied a transitional environmental zone between open steppe and wooded highland. Its elevation provided strategic visibility over surrounding terrain. Archaeologists note that such liminal ecological settings often attracted repeated human visitation because they offered access to multiple resource zones within manageable distance. The Younger Dryas episode introduced renewed environmental stress. According to isotope records from Greenland ice cores and corroborating Near Eastern data, temperatures declined rapidly at its onset. Reduced precipitation likely shortened growing seasons for wild cereals and altered migratory timing of herd animals. In response, epipaleolithic communities across Southwest Asia appear to have intensified mobility strategies. Lithic assemblages from contemporary sites show evidence of flexible toolkits suited to shifting hunting and gathering conditions. Archaeological surveys across Upper Mesopotamia demonstrate that human groups did not abandon the region during these fluctuations. Instead, settlement patterns indicate cyclical occupation of favored landscapes. Seasonal camps appear in valleys during resource-rich periods and retreat to upland zones during scarcity. This mobility suggests adaptation rather than collapse. Records indicate increasing regional interaction during this period, as groups expanded their seasonal ranges to mitigate localized shortages. The ecological instability of the late Pleistocene therefore created a dynamic environment rather than a static one. Abundance existed, but predictability did not. Wild cereals could be harvested in dense stands, yet their availability depended on rainfall variability. Gazelle herds provided significant protein, but migration timing required coordination and knowledge of terrain. Such conditions favored cooperative information sharing among dispersed bands. Archaeologists emphasize that this was not yet an agricultural world. No morphological evidence for domesticated plant species appears in layers securely dated before the end of the Younger Dryas. However, grinding stones and sickle blades from contemporaneous epipaleolithic contexts demonstrate intensive plant exploitation. Records indicate increasing reliance on broad-spectrum subsistence strategies, combining hunting, gathering, and small-scale resource management. The environmental constraints of the late Pleistocene shaped human behavior in measurable ways. Fluctuating rainfall patterns encouraged seasonal aggregation in resource-rich zones. Transitional landscapes offered strategic advantages for monitoring herds and harvesting cereals. Elevated ridges, such as the one at Göbekli Tepe, provided defensible and visible meeting grounds. Archaeologists uncovered no permanent domestic architecture from this specific period at the site, suggesting repeated visitation rather than continuous habitation. By 9700 BCE, the Younger Dryas ended abruptly, and the Holocene began. Warmer and wetter conditions expanded vegetation zones once again, increasing ecological stability across Upper Mesopotamia. The environmental volatility that characterized the preceding millennia had fostered mobility, cooperation, and adaptive strategies among human groups. Within this fluctuating world, human communities developed increasingly complex social networks. Before continuing into the deeper historical sequence, consider supporting the channel. If you value academically grounded, chronologically precise historical documentaries, subscribe to Nightfall History and activate notifications to receive future long-form releases. New episodes explore early civilizations, empires, and transformative eras with evidence-based clarity. Before cities, before farms, some hunter-gatherers were already living in structured communities. Between approximately 15,000 and 10,000 BCE, societies across the Levant underwent significant social and economic transformation. This period, known as the Epipaleolithic, witnessed the emergence of the Natufian culture. Identified through distinctive stone tools, architectural remains, and burial practices, archaeologists first recognized the Natufian horizon in the early 20th century, and subsequent excavations have clarified its chronological placement between roughly 13,000 and 10,000 BCE. Radiocarbon dating from multiple sites confirms this time frame. At sites such as Ain Malaha in northern Israel and early levels at Jericho, excavators uncovered semi-subterranean circular dwellings constructed from stone foundations. These structures indicate repeated or prolonged occupation rather than short-term encampments. Records indicate that some Natufian settlements persisted seasonally or year-round in ecologically rich zones, particularly near water sources. The presence of hearths, storage pits, and architectural rebuilding phases suggests degrees of permanence uncommon in earlier Upper Paleolithic contexts. Lithic assemblages from Natufian sites include stone sickle blades with gloss produced by cutting silica-rich grasses. Microwear analysis confirms their use in harvesting wild cereals. Ground stone mortars and pestles appear in substantial numbers, demonstrating systematic processing of plant resources. Archaeologists uncovered charred remains of wild barley and wheat species in several Levantine sites, indicating intensive gathering. However, morphological analysis shows these cereals retained wild characteristics, confirming that domestication had not yet occurred. Burial practices from this period provide further evidence of social organization. At Ain Malaha and other sites, individuals were interred within settlement areas, sometimes beneath house floors. Some graves contain personal ornaments, including shell beads and bone tools. The presence of grave goods suggests symbolic differentiation among individuals. In certain cases, secondary burials indicate deliberate manipulation of skeletal remains after decomposition. Such practices imply ritual frameworks that extended beyond immediate subsistence concerns. Long-distance exchange networks are also visible in the archaeological record. Marine shells originating from the Mediterranean and Red Sea appear at inland sites, sometimes over 100 kilometers from their source. Obsidian artifacts recovered from Levantine settlements have been traced through geochemical analysis to Anatolian sources. These findings indicate structured exchange systems across considerable distances. Records indicate that mobility was not random but followed predictable seasonal and interregional patterns. The Natufian economy combined hunting, plant gathering, and limited territorial stability. Faunal assemblages show a heavy reliance on gazelle, alongside smaller game and birds. Age profiles of hunted animals suggest systematic targeting rather than opportunistic capture. Settlement distribution patterns indicate strategic placement within ecologically productive zones, including river valleys and woodland steppe transitions. These choices reflect adaptive responses to climatic fluctuations during the final millennia of the Pleistocene. Communal activity appears to have intensified during this period. Larger settlement clusters and shared architectural spaces imply aggregation events. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of communal grinding installations in some sites, suggesting cooperative food processing. The scale of these installations exceeds what a single household would require. Records indicate that periodic gatherings likely reinforced social alliances between dispersed groups. Although Göbekli Tepe predates fully sedentary village life, the Natufian example demonstrates that social complexity did not depend exclusively on agriculture. The development of semi-permanent dwellings, ritualized burial customs, and exchange networks occurred before domesticated crops became widespread. These features indicate structured communities capable of coordinated labor and symbolic behavior. Archaeological evidence further suggests increasing territoriality. The density of settlement in certain Levantine zones implies defined resource areas. Cemeteries placed within habitation zones may have functioned as markers of group identity tied to specific landscapes. Records indicate that demographic growth during this period may have increased competition for prime ecological niches. By the close of the Epi-Paleolithic, Southwest Asia contained communities that combined mobility with structured settlement, ritual behavior, and economic intensification. These societies were not urban, nor were they agricultural in the strict sense. However, they demonstrate social organization, symbolic systems, and interregional connectivity that foreshadow later developments. This growing complexity set the stage for a transformation in Upper Mesopotamia. For decades, the hilltop of Göbekli Tepe concealed its true antiquity. The limestone ridge known today as Göbekli Tepe rises gently above the Harran Plain in southeastern Turkey, approximately 15 kilometers northeast of modern Şanlıurfa. To local villagers, the mound appeared as a natural elevation scattered with worked stones. Surface fragments of limestone and occasional carved blocks were visible, but no systematic excavation had been undertaken during the early 20th century. Its archaeological significance remained unrecognized. In 1963, a joint survey conducted by Istanbul University and the University of Chicago documented the site as part of a broader regional assessment of southeastern Anatolia. Survey teams recorded the mound and noted the presence of limestone fragments and worked stones embedded in the soil. However, the carved blocks visible at the surface were tentatively identified as remnants of a Byzantine cemetery. Records indicate that the T-shaped forms were misinterpreted as simple grave markers. No excavation followed this preliminary classification, and the site remained undisturbed. The misidentification reflected the methodological limitations of surface survey alone. Without stratigraphic excavation or radiocarbon analysis, chronological placement depended largely on stylistic comparison. The carved stones lacked obvious decorative motifs familiar from known Neolithic contexts at the time. Furthermore, large-scale pre-pottery Neolithic monumental architecture had not yet been documented elsewhere in the region. As a result, there was no established framework through which to interpret the unusual stone forms. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited the mound while conducting fieldwork in southeastern Turkey. Schmidt had previously worked at Neolithic sites, including Navali Kori, where T-shaped pillars had been identified within pre-pottery Neolithic contexts. Upon examining the surface remains at Göbekli Tepe, he recognized similarities in pillar morphology. The scale and workmanship suggested intentional anthropomorphic design rather than later funerary markers. According to excavation reports, Schmidt observed carved reliefs partially exposed at the surface, including depictions of animals in low relief. These carvings differed significantly from Byzantine iconography. Their style corresponded more closely to early Neolithic artistic traditions identified in Upper Mesopotamia. This observation prompted a reassessment of the site's chronological placement. The hypothesis emerged that the mound might represent an early pre-pottery Neolithic ritual complex. Formal excavations began in 1995 under the direction of Schmidt, operating through the German Archaeological Institute in cooperation with the Şanlıurfa Museum. Initial trenches quickly revealed large T-shaped pillars arranged in circular patterns. Stratigraphic excavation demonstrated that these pillars were embedded in prepared stone sockets, indicating deliberate architectural planning. Radiocarbon samples obtained from associated organic material soon produced dates reaching back to the 10th millennium BCE. The early excavation seasons established that the mound was not a cemetery of the Byzantine period, but rather a deeply stratified Neolithic site. Layers of backfill covered monumental enclosures, preserving them beneath accumulated debris. Archaeologists uncovered carved reliefs of foxes, snakes, and other wild animals, confirming symbolic complexity. The discovery expanded the known scale of pre-pottery Neolithic architecture beyond previous expectations. The identification of Göbekli Tepe represents a significant case study in the evolution of archaeological interpretation. Initial survey classification relied on limited visible evidence and comparative assumptions. Subsequent expertise in Neolithic architecture enabled a revised assessment grounded in broader regional knowledge. Records indicate that without prior discoveries at Navali Kori and other Anatolian sites, recognition of the pillar's antiquity might have been further delayed. By the late 1990s, continued excavation revealed multiple circular enclosures beneath the surface. Each contained massive limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons. Radiocarbon analysis consistently placed the earliest construction phases between approximately 9,600 and 9,000 BCE. These dates positioned the site thousands of years earlier than Stonehenge and well before the emergence of urban civilization in Mesopotamia or the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. Excavation soon revealed architecture far older than Stonehenge or the pyramids. Carbon dating pushed the origins of monumental architecture back thousands of years. Systematic excavation at Gobekli Tepe began in 1995 under the direction of Klaus Schmidt and quickly established that the mound contained multiple stratified occupation phases. Archaeologists employed standard stratigraphic methods, carefully documenting soil layers, construction sequences, and associated artifacts. Early trenching revealed that the visible surface stones represented only a fraction of the site's architectural complexity. Beneath accumulated fill lay distinct building horizons separated by intentional backfilling episodes. Radiocarbon analysis played a decisive role in establishing the site's chronology. Charcoal samples recovered from construction fills and occupation deposits were submitted to multiple laboratories for testing. Calibrated radiocarbon dates consistently placed the earliest monumental phase around 9,600 BCE, corresponding to the pre-Pottery Neolithic A, PPNA. These dates situate the initial construction immediately after the onset of the Holocene and shortly following the Younger Dryas climatic episode. The results extended the known timeline of monumental architecture by several millennia. Stratigraphic excavation identified three principal layers. The deepest and most significant, designated Layer 3, contained the large circular enclosures built from massive T-shaped limestone pillars. These structures represent the earliest architectural phase and are securely dated to the 10th and early 9th millennia BCE. The enclosures were constructed directly into bedrock and surrounded by prepared stone walls. Archaeologists documented repeated building episodes within this layer, indicating sustained activity rather than a single construction event. Above Layer 3 lies Layer 2, associated with the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, PPNB, dated approximately between 8800 and 800 BCE. This phase introduced smaller-scale rectangular buildings, differing markedly from the earlier circular enclosures. The architectural shift from circular to rectilinear forms corresponds with broader regional changes observed at contemporaneous sites such as Keonu and Navali Kori. Lithic assemblages from Layer 2 show typological features consistent with established PPNB tool traditions, including pressure-flaked projectile points. Layer I consists primarily of later deposits, including eroded material and limited evidence of much later activity. This uppermost layer reflects natural sediment accumulation and minor disturbances rather than substantial occupation. No large-scale architectural remains from post-Neolithic periods were identified within primary excavation zones, reinforcing the conclusion that the site's principal significance belongs to the early Neolithic. The chronological framework is supported not only by radiocarbon dates but also by lithic typology. Stone tool assemblages recovered from Layer 3 correspond to known PPNA forms, including specific projectile point styles and blade technologies. Comparative analysis with other dated PPNA sites strengthens chronological consistency. Records indicate that the absence of pottery throughout Layers 3 and 2 aligns with the pre-pottery designation, confirming placement before the widespread adoption of ceramic technology. Architectural sequencing further corroborates the dating evidence. The deepest enclosures exhibit construction methods distinct from later rectangular buildings. Pillar sockets, floor preparation techniques, and wall bonding patterns reveal deliberate planning in each phase. The transition from monumental circular structures to smaller rectilinear rooms occurred in a stratigraphically clear sequence, without evidence of overlapping construction. This orderly progression indicates temporal separation rather than functional variation within a single occupation horizon. Importantly, the radiocarbon dates were obtained from short-lived organic materials where possible, reducing the risk of old wood effects that can distort chronological estimates. Calibration curves adjusted for fluctuations in atmospheric carbon levels provide reliable placement within the early Holocene. Multiple samples from different trenches yielded consistent results, reinforcing confidence in the timeline. The dating of Göbekli Tepe to approximately 9600 BCE has significant implications for understanding early human architecture. At this point in time, there is no evidence for widespread domesticated plant or animal species in the region. The construction of monumental stone enclosures therefore predates agricultural surplus economies. Records indicate that these findings required reassessment of long-held assumptions linking monumentality exclusively to sedentary farming societies. By establishing a secure chronological framework through stratigraphy, radiocarbon analysis, and comparative typology, archaeologists confirmed the site's deep antiquity. The evidence demonstrates that large-scale architectural planning occurred at the threshold of the Holocene, during the earliest phases of the Neolithic transition. The architectural plan revealed a deliberate and symbolic design. Around 9600 BCE, stone was cut on a scale previously unknown in human history. Radiocarbon evidence places the earliest monumental phase of Göbekli Tepe between approximately 9600 and 9000 BCE, within the Pre-Pottery Neolithic (PPNA). During this period, builders quarried, shaped, and transported massive limestone pillars without metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or domesticated draft animals. The archaeological record preserves clear physical evidence of these extraction processes in the bedrock surrounding the enclosures. The site sits atop a limestone ridge composed of relatively soft, workable stone. Surveys have identified quarry areas less than 100 meters from the principal architectural complexes. These extraction zones contain visible tool marks, partially detached pillars, and large negative impressions where monoliths were removed. The proximity of quarry to construction area reduced transportation distances, suggesting deliberate site selection based on geological suitability. Excavation of quarry surfaces reveals a consistent extraction method. Builders first outlined the intended pillar shape directly into the bedrock using flint tools. They then carved a trench around the perimeter, gradually isolating the monolith from the surrounding rock. Evidence indicates that horizontal channels were cut beneath the base before levering techniques were applied to detach the stone. Unfinished pillars remain embedded in situ, preserving these intermediary stages of production. These abandoned pieces provide rare insight into technical procedures otherwise lost to time. The T-shaped pillars, characteristic of the site's monumental enclosures, vary in size but frequently exceed 5 meters in height. Estimated weights range from 10 to 20 tons, depending on dimensions and density. Calculations based on limestone mass suggest that even the smaller pillars required coordinated labor for movement. The absence of metal tools confirms that shaping was accomplished entirely with lithic implements, primarily flint chisels, hammerstones, and picks. Tool where patterns found in excavation layers correspond to intensive stoneworking activity. No evidence of copper or other early metallurgy has been recovered from PPNA contexts at the site. This confirms that all quarrying and carving operations occurred within a lithic technological framework. Despite this limitation, the precision of the finished pillars demonstrates advanced craftsmanship. Flat surfaces, sharply defined edges, and symmetrical proportions indicate careful measurement and planning rather than opportunistic extraction. Logistical considerations further highlight the organizational capacity of the builders. Removing a 15-ton pillar from bedrock requires not only physical strength but coordinated sequencing. Trenching, undercutting, levering, stabilization, and controlled lowering. Archaeologists propose that wooden beams, rollers, and rope systems may have been employed, though organic materials have not survived in direct association with quarry contexts. Experimental archaeology suggests that teams of several dozen individuals could maneuver such loads using simple mechanical principles, particularly on prepared surfaces. Importantly, there is no archaeological evidence for domesticated draft animals during the PPNA phase in southeastern Anatolia. The transport of monoliths therefore depended entirely on human labor. The limited distance between quarry and enclosure reduces, but does not eliminate the engineering challenge. Even over short spans, raising and positioning multi-ton pillars vertically would require coordinated lifting systems, possibly involving earthen ramps or leverage frames constructed from timber. The extraction zones also indicate selective quarrying practices. Builders did not remove stone randomly. Instead, they targeted specific bedrock sections with consistent grain and structural integrity. This selectivity implies geological knowledge acquired through observation and experience. The presence of partially completed pillars suggests that flawed blocks were sometimes abandoned before full detachment, indicating quality control in the production process. Labor organization remains a subject of scholarly debate. The absence of permanent residential architecture from the earliest layers raises questions about whether quarrying was conducted by sedentary inhabitants or by groups assembling seasonally. Some researchers propose that hunter-gatherer communities may have congregated periodically for large-scale construction events. Such gatherings would have provided sufficient workforce while distributing labor demands across social networks. The scale of extraction implies planning beyond a single family or small band. Energy expenditure calculations reinforce this conclusion. Quarrying multiple 10 to 20-ton pillars would require sustained effort over extended periods. The repetition of this process across several enclosures suggests long-term planning rather than isolated experimentation. Radiocarbon dating indicates that construction episodes occurred across generations, implying continuity of technical knowledge and social coordination. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that monumental stone extraction at Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture in the region. The earliest domesticated cereals appear slightly later in the broader Fertile Crescent. This chronological relationship challenges earlier models that assumed agricultural surplus as a prerequisite for monument building. Instead, quarrying operations at Göbekli Tepe illustrate that pre-agricultural communities possessed the capacity for sustained logistical planning and organized labor mobilization. The quarry remains provide a rare, tangible record of prehistoric engineering practice. Unlike finished architectural forms, which often conceal their production history, the extraction scars in bedrock preserve the sequence of actions required to free each monolith. These traces allow reconstruction of technical processes with unusual clarity for the 10th millennium BCE. In sum, the quarrying and stone extraction evidence confirms that around 9600 BCE, communities in southeastern Anatolia engaged in large-scale lithic engineering previously undocumented for this period. The coordination, technical skill, and labor investment reflected in these operations indicate a level of social organization not traditionally attributed to early hunter-gatherer societies. Once quarried, the pillars were arranged according to a deliberate architectural plan. The enclosures were not random gatherings of stone, they followed a clear architectural grammar. The earliest monumental phase of Gobekli Tepe, designated Layer 3, is defined by a series of large circular or oval enclosures constructed directly into the limestone bedrock. These structures range approximately between 10 and 20 meters in diameter. Their dimensions vary slightly, yet their internal organization follows a remarkably consistent pattern, indicating deliberate planning rather than ad hoc construction. Each enclosure consists of a ring of upright T-shaped limestone pillars set into a circular stone wall. The pillars are integrated into stone benches that line the interior perimeter. At the center of every fully excavated enclosure stand two significantly taller T-pillars facing one another. These central monoliths dominate the spatial arrangement, both physically and symbolically. Their size often exceeds that of the surrounding pillars, and their placement creates a focal axis within the structure. The circular ground plan required advanced planning before construction began. Builders first cut shallow foundation trenches into bedrock to stabilize the perimeter walls and pillar bases. The even spacing of pillars along the circumference indicates measurement and proportional calculation. While no written system existed, spatial regularity implies standardized construction practices transmitted across generations. Excavated enclosures, particularly enclosures A, B, C, and D, demonstrate a repeated architectural formula. Circular wall, integrated seating bench, evenly spaced perimeter pillars, and two taller central monoliths. The persistence of this pattern across multiple structures suggests a formalized architectural tradition. This repetition is unlikely to result from coincidence. Rather, it indicates shared design principles embedded within community knowledge. The central pillars appear to carry anthropomorphic characteristics. In enclosure D, the most extensively studied example, carved reliefs depict stylized arms descending along the sides of the monoliths, with hands meeting at the front. Carved belts and loincloths are also visible. These features transform abstract T-shapes into highly stylized human representations. The head is implied by the horizontal crossbar, while the vertical shaft functions as torso. The absence of facial detail does not diminish the anthropomorphic interpretation. Instead, it suggests symbolic abstraction. The orientation of the twin central pillars toward one another creates a spatial dialogue within the enclosure. Their alignment divides the circular space along a subtle axis, potentially organizing movement and ritual positioning. The surrounding pillars form a secondary ring, visually enclosing the central pair. This layered arrangement reinforces hierarchical spatial design. Outer ring, inner focal pair. Stone benches built into the circular walls further structure the interior. These benches are continuous along portions of the enclosure and appear to have been constructed simultaneously with the walls and pillars. Their presence implies that participants gathered along the perimeter while the central zone remained distinct. The absence of domestic features such as hearths or storage pits supports the interpretation that these spaces were not residential. Geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry have identified anomalies consistent with additional circular enclosures beneath the unexcavated portions of the mound. Current estimates suggest that more than 20 such structures may remain buried. This scale reinforces the interpretation of Göbekli Tepe as a large ceremonial complex rather than an isolated structure. The buried enclosures follow the same circular pattern detected in excavated examples, strengthening the argument for architectural standardization. The circular form itself warrants consideration. Circular architecture predates rectilinear building traditions in many early Neolithic contexts. However, the scale observed here exceeds typical domestic roundhouses known from other PPNA sites. The dimensions and monumentality distinguish these enclosures from habitation structures. Their design required coordinated planning, quarrying, transport, and precise placement. Transition to Layer 2 architecture, characterized by smaller rectangular buildings, marks a significant shift in spatial organization. This later phase abandons the monumental circular template in favor of compartmentalized rectilinear rooms. The clear stratigraphic separation between circular and rectangular forms underscores the intentionality of each design phase rather than gradual modification of the same layout. The uniformity of Layer 3 enclosures suggests that architectural knowledge was codified within the community. The repetition of key elements, dual central pillars, perimeter ring, integrated benches, indicates that builders followed established conventions. Even where minor variations appear in pillar size or decorative motifs, the structural blueprint remains consistent. Engineering considerations also reveal deliberate planning. The central pillars were positioned in prepared sockets cut into bedrock, ensuring stability. Perimeter pillars were embedded within walls, distributing weight and reinforcing structural cohesion. The circular wall served both as enclosure and as stabilizing framework for the monoliths. This architectural grammar demonstrates that monumentality at Göbekli Tepe was not experimental or accidental. It reflects sustained conceptual planning across multiple construction episodes. The consistency across enclosures implies shared symbolic or ritual functions governing their layout. The spatial design, therefore, reveals an early example of standardized monumental architecture dating to the 10th millennium BCE. These enclosures represent more than stone assemblies. They embody a reproducible architectural system maintained over generations. The carvings upon these pillars introduce a symbolic system central to interpretation. The imagery emphasizes danger, power, and transformation. The monumental enclosures of Göbekli Tepe are distinguished not only by their architectural scale, but by an extensive program of carved reliefs. These carvings overwhelmingly depict animals, with a marked emphasis on predatory species. Lions, leopards, foxes, snakes, scorpions, wild boars, and birds of prey dominate the iconographic field. Herbivores appear less frequently and rarely occupy central compositional positions. The selective representation of fauna suggests intentional symbolic prioritization rather than simple environmental cataloging. Radiocarbon sequences securely date the carved pillars of Layer 3 to the early Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, PPNA, beginning around 9600 BCE. This chronology establishes the imagery as among the earliest known examples of large-scale narrative or symbolic stone relief in human history. The carvings were executed directly onto the limestone surfaces after quarrying and erection, indicating that iconography formed an integral component of the architectural design rather than a later addition. Predatory animals are depicted in high relief, often in dynamic or confrontational poses. Snakes coil across pillar faces in repeated linear patterns. Foxes appear in profile, elongated and alert. Felines are shown with pronounced musculature and exposed teeth. Scorpions and spiders are carved with careful attention to anatomical detail. The prominence of such creatures suggests an emphasis on danger and potency. These are animals capable of harming or killing humans. Their clustering within ritual spaces may reflect symbolic engagement with forces perceived as powerful or transformative. Vultures occupy a particularly significant place within the iconographic repertoire. On several pillars, large birds of prey are rendered with extended wings and downward-facing beaks. Similar imagery appears millennia later at Catalhoyuk, where wall paintings depict vultures interacting with headless human figures. At Göbekli Tepe, while no direct depiction of decapitation has been conclusively identified in Layer 3, the prominence of vultures has led some scholars to propose the possibility of excarnation rituals, exposure of the dead to scavenging birds. Comparative archaeological parallels strengthen this hypothesis. At Jericho, plastered skulls from early Neolithic contexts suggest complex mortuary practices involving secondary burial and manipulation of human remains. Although Göbekli Tepe has not yielded definitive human burials within Layer 3 enclosures, the absence of graves does not exclude mortuary association. The monumental enclosures may have functioned as ceremonial spaces connected to rites performed elsewhere on the site. The lack of direct burial evidence in Layer 3 remains notable. Excavation has not uncovered formal graves within the central enclosures, nor has it revealed extensive human skeletal material. This contrasts with later Neolithic settlements where burial beneath house floors becomes common. The absence may support interpretations of the site as a specialized ritual center rather than a habitation zone. If excarnation or other mortuary rites occurred, they may have left limited osteological traces. Another interpretive model views the animal imagery as emblematic or totemic. Clusters of specific animals appear concentrated within individual enclosures. For example, one structure may prominently feature foxes, while another emphasizes serpents or boars. Such patterning has led to suggestions that the animals represent clan identifiers or mythic beings associated with particular social groups. If multiple communities participated in the construction and use of the site, distinct animal motifs may have signaled group identity within a shared ceremonial complex. The distribution of carvings also reflects compositional planning. Reliefs are not randomly placed. They often occupy prominent positions on the broad faces of T-pillars. Some are oriented inward toward the central pair, reinforcing the enclosure's focal symmetry. Others wrap around edges, creating a sense of movement across surfaces. The technical execution varies between high and low relief, demonstrating both artistic variation and skilled stoneworking. Importantly, many of the animals depicted correspond to species known from faunal remains recovered in the region. This suggests that the imagery was grounded in lived ecological experience rather than purely imagined forms. Yet the emphasis on predators over prey indicates symbolic selection rather than subsistence documentation. Hunting scenes are notably absent. Animals appear isolated rather than engaged in narrative sequences, reinforcing the impression of emblematic representation. The combination of predatory imagery and monumental scale may reflect cosmological concepts centered on power and transformation. Predators occupy apex positions within ecological hierarchies. Their symbolic prominence could mirror perceived spiritual hierarchies. The recurrent depiction of dangerous creatures may signify engagement with forces beyond ordinary human control. Chronological analysis confirms that these carvings belong to the earliest architectural phase. Radiocarbon samples from associated construction fill a line consistently with PPNA dates. There is no evidence that the relief program represents later embellishment. The iconography is therefore contemporary with the initial erection of the monumental enclosures. Comparative analysis across early Neolithic sites suggests that symbolic complexity preceded or accompanied the shift toward agriculture. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that sophisticated iconographic systems were already established among pre-agricultural communities. The imagery's coherence across multiple enclosures implies shared symbolic frameworks rather than isolated artistic expression. The dominance of predatory animals, the repeated appearance of vultures, and the absence of domestic scenes together construct a thematic emphasis on potency, mortality, and perhaps transcendence. Whether interpreted as mortuary symbolism, clan identity markers, or cosmological beings, the animal carvings form a structured visual language embedded within architecture. Beyond animals, the pillars themselves may represent human forms. At the center of each enclosure stand silent human forms in stone. Within the circular enclosures of Göbekli Tepe, the most imposing features are the paired T-shaped monoliths positioned at the center of each structure. These pillars, often exceeding 5 meters in height, differ not only in scale but in iconographic detail from the surrounding perimeter stones. Nowhere is this clearer than in Enclosure D, where carved anatomical elements transform abstract geometry into stylized human representation. On the broad faces of the central pillars in Enclosure D, low-relief carvings depict arms descending vertically along the sides. The forearms curve inward, and hands meet across the lower front surface. The fingers are clearly delineated, though simplified. Around the midsection, carved belts encircle the stone, from which hangs a fox pelt motif rendered with careful attention to tail and hide contours. These details collectively create a coherent anthropomorphic schema. The vertical shaft forms the torso, the crossbar suggests shoulders or head, and the carved arms and belt complete the bodily outline. The absence of facial features is consistent across all known examples. No eyes, nose, or mouth appear on the horizontal crossbar. This omission indicates intentional abstraction rather than incomplete workmanship. The human form is implied through posture and accessories rather than portraiture. Such abstraction may reflect symbolic generalization, representing archetypal beings rather than specific individuals. The fox pelt motif merits particular attention. Foxes appear frequently in the animal reliefs of Layer 3, often depicted in profile along pillar faces. When integrated into the anthropomorphic figures as garments, they suggest status or role differentiation. The pelt may symbolize authority, ritual function, or affiliation. Its repeated presence reinforces the interpretation that these central pillars represent more than structural supports. They embody stylized persons or personified entities. Spatial positioning strengthens this interpretation. The two central pillars face one another across the enclosure's interior. Their orientation establishes a relational axis within the circular plan. Unlike the perimeter pillars, which are embedded within walls and partially integrated into benches, the central pair stands isolated and elevated. This distinction emphasizes their primacy. The deliberate facing posture suggests interaction or symbolic dialogue, reinforcing the anthropomorphic reading. Comparative analysis supports the conclusion that these forms represent human or human-like beings. At Karahan Tepe, another early Neolithic site in southeastern Anatolia, similar T-shaped pillars have been identified. Although excavation remains ongoing, preliminary findings indicate continuity in pillar morphology and symbolic function across the region. The recurrence of T-pillars at multiple sites suggests a shared ritual vocabulary rather than isolated innovation. The standardized form of the T-pillar further indicates conceptual consistency. The horizontal crossbar creates a distinct silhouette not easily explained as purely structural. From a functional perspective, A simple upright slab would suffice for support. The addition of the transverse element implies symbolic necessity. When viewed anthropomorphically, the crossbar serves as stylized shoulders or head, completing the bodily abstraction. Notably, the anthropomorphic features are concentrated on the central pillars rather than the perimeter stones. While surrounding pillars bear extensive animal reliefs, they lack carved arms and belts. This differentiation suggests hierarchical representation within the enclosure. The central monoliths may symbolize elevated beings, ancestral figures, mythic entities, or supernatural guardians, while the animal carvings around them contribute to a broader cosmological tableau. The scale of the central pillars reinforces their significance. Weighing between 10 and 20 tons, their extraction and erection required substantial coordinated labor. The investment of effort implies symbolic importance commensurate with physical magnitude. Their placement in prepared sockets carved into bedrock ensured stability and permanence, further underscoring intentional centrality. The relational positioning of the paired pillars may also structure ritual movement. Participants seated along perimeter benches would face inward toward the central axis. The twin monoliths would dominate visual attention, framing the interior space. Whether ceremonies involved recitation, offering, or communal observance, the anthropomorphic pillars would serve as focal embodiments of meaning. Interpretation remains cautious due to the absence of textual evidence. No inscriptions accompany the carvings. Archaeological reasoning therefore relies on physical features, spatial analysis, and regional comparison. The combination of carved limbs, belts, and garments provides tangible evidence for anthropomorphic representation. The abstraction does not negate personhood. Rather, it signals symbolic stylization characteristic of early monumental art. Regional uniformity strengthens the argument for shared belief systems. The appearance of T-pillars at Karahan Tepe indicates that this architectural and symbolic form extended beyond a single mound. Such uniformity suggests networks of interaction and shared ritual frameworks across southeastern Anatolia during the early PPNA. The anthropomorphic pillars thus represent a critical dimension of Göbekli Tepe's ritual architecture. They demonstrate that monumental engineering was coupled with representational intent. Stone became not only structural medium but embodied symbol. The abstraction of the human form into geometric monoliths indicates conceptual sophistication and standardized iconography. Through carved arms, belts, and posture, these silent figures occupy the center of the enclosure as focal presences. Their relational positioning and regional parallels reinforce their interpretive significance as stylized human or superhuman forms embedded within early Neolithic cosmology. Ritual architecture also shaped patterns of gathering and social interaction. Long before domesticated herds, organized hunting sustained monumental construction. Zooarchaeological analysis from Layer 3 at Göbekli Tepe, dated approximately 9600 to 8800 BCE, indicates a faunal assemblage composed almost entirely of wild species. The dominance of undomesticated animals confirms that the monumental phase predates formal herd management or animal domestication in the region. Gazelle remains constitute a substantial proportion of the identified bone fragments. Alongside gazelle, archaeologists have documented aurochs, wild cattle, wild boar, red deer, and onager. These species reflect the ecological diversity of Upper Mesopotamia at the onset of the Holocene. The presence of both large and medium game suggests flexible hunting strategies adapted to varied terrain, including open steppe and woodland margins. Cut marks on long bones and joint surfaces provide direct evidence of systematic butchery. Percussion fractures indicate deliberate marrow extraction, demonstrating efficient processing rather than opportunistic consumption. The pattern of bone fragmentation suggests skilled disarticulation and division of carcasses. There is no indication of ritual avoidance of meat processing. Instead, the evidence reflects practical subsistence activity on a significant scale. Crucially, age profiles of the animal remains do not display the selective culling patterns associated with domesticated herd management. In managed herds, one expects overrepresentation of young males and older females due to breeding strategies. At Göbekli Tepe, age distribution appears consistent with opportunistic hunting of wild populations. This absence of demographic manipulation confirms that subsistence relied on hunting rather than controlled breeding. Seasonality studies provide additional insight. Dental eruption patterns and isotopic analysis suggest that many gazelle were hunted during spring and autumn migration periods. These seasonal peaks correspond to times when herds would have been more predictable and concentrated. The data imply that occupation intensity at the site may have increased during these migration windows. Bone concentrations discovered near enclosure contexts indicate large-scale processing events. The density of remains exceeds what would be expected from small domestic units. Instead, the accumulation pattern supports communal consumption, possibly associated with gatherings linked to construction or ritual activity. The volume of faunal material suggests coordinated hunting capable of provisioning sizable groups. Such provisioning would require planning and cooperation among dispersed hunter-gatherer networks. The logistical capacity to supply repeated gatherings reinforces interpretations of Göbekli Tepe as a seasonal aggregation center rather than a permanent settlement. Mobile groups across Upper Mesopotamia may have converged periodically, bringing hunted resources to sustain collective labor and ceremonial activity. The faunal evidence therefore demonstrates that pre-agricultural economies could generate sufficient surplus to support monumental construction and communal feasting. Organized hunting, rather than domesticated herds, underpinned the social and ritual systems visible in the archaeological record. Alongside hunting, plant exploitation played an increasingly significant role. The seeds of agriculture were present but not yet domesticated. Archaeobotanical evidence from Layer 3 at Göbekli Tepe indicates that plant exploitation formed a significant component of subsistence alongside organized hunting. Carbonized seed remains recovered through flotation analysis include wild einkorn and wild barley varieties, native to the surrounding uplands, particularly the Karakadag region. This area is widely recognized as a natural habitat for ancestral cereal species during the early Holocene. Grinding stones, mortars, and pestles have been documented in excavation contexts associated with the monumental phase. Use-wear analysis on these stone tools reveals surface smoothing and striation patterns consistent with cereal grinding. The presence of such implements demonstrates systematic plant processing rather than incidental consumption. Cereals were not merely gathered and eaten whole, they were mechanically reduced into flour or meal, implying dietary reliance. Despite this evidence of intensive use, morphological analysis of recovered grains shows no definitive domestication traits in the earliest layers. Domesticated cereals typically exhibit non-shattering rachis structures, allowing grains to remain attached for harvest. The specimens from Layer 3 retain characteristics of wild varieties, including brittle rachises that naturally disperse seeds. This distinction confirms that systematic cultivation and genetic domestication had not yet occurred during the primary monumental phase. Carbon isotope studies further support an interpretation of intensive gathering rather than formal agriculture. Soil samples and plant remains do not display consistent signatures associated with long-term cultivation or manuring practices. Instead, the evidence suggests repeated harvesting from naturally occurring cereal stands. The proximity of Göbekli Tepe to dense wild grain habitats would have provided predictable seasonal yields without the need for planted fields. The scale of grinding equipment implies that cereal processing may have supported communal events. Large grinding stones are not easily transported and likely remained at the site. Their presence suggests repeated occupation episodes involving preparation of substantial quantities of plant food. Combined with the faunal evidence, this indicates a mixed subsistence strategy capable of generating surplus for periodic gatherings. Some researchers propose that early forms of experimental management may have occurred. Selective harvesting, clearing competing vegetation, or encouraging regrowth near favored stands could represent pre-domestication interventions. Such practices fall short of systematic farming but reflect intensification of plant exploitation. This transitional phase illustrates how economic behaviors can shift incrementally before clear morphological domestication becomes archaeologically visible. The coexistence of large-scale ritual architecture and intensified plant processing challenges earlier models that placed agriculture as a prerequisite for social complexity. At Göbekli Tepe, economic intensification appears to have preceded full domestication. Hunter-gatherer groups were already investing labor into cereal harvesting and processing while continuing mobile hunting strategies. The evidence therefore clarifies a critical distinction. Plant exploitation does not equate to agriculture. Wild cereals were central to subsistence, yet they remained genetically undomesticated during the earliest phases. This period represents an intermediary stage in which resource use intensified, laying groundwork for later agricultural transformation. Resource intensification may have required new systems of coordination and authority. Monumental construction preceded permanent settlement. The erection of multi-ton limestone pillars at Göbekli Tepe required coordinated labor on a scale previously unattributed to pre-agricultural societies. Individual T-shaped monoliths, weighing between 10 and 20 tons, had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and raised into prepared bedrock sockets. Such tasks exceed the capabilities of small kin-based bands acting independently. Experimental archaeology provides insight into plausible logistics. Reconstructions suggest that teams of approximately 50 to 100 individuals could transport stones of comparable weight using wooden sledges, rollers, rope systems, and controlled leverage. Even over relatively short distances, often less than 100 meters from quarry to enclosure, movement of these pillars would demand synchronized effort, planning, and sustained cooperation. Raising the monoliths vertically would require additional coordination, likely involving earthen ramps or wooden support frames. Notably, Layer 3 excavations have not revealed evidence of permanent domestic housing. There are no clearly defined house foundations, hearth clusters typical of residential occupation, or storage facilities consistent with year-round settlement. This absence suggests that Göbekli Tepe functioned not as a village but as a specialized ritual center. The workforce responsible for construction may have assembled seasonally, drawing participants from dispersed hunter-gatherer groups across Upper Mesopotamia. Seasonal aggregation models align with faunal seasonality data indicating peak occupation during gazelle migration periods. Groups may have converged for communal hunts, ritual gatherings, and construction projects within the same seasonal window. Such periodic congregation would supply both the manpower and the subsistence resources necessary for monumental building without requiring permanent settlement. The capacity to mobilize dozens, possibly hundreds, of individuals implies structured coordination. Tasks such as quarrying, carving, transport, and erection must have been sequenced and supervised. While the archaeological record does not provide direct evidence of hereditary elites, no rich burials, no prestige goods clearly associated with specific individuals, the scale of organization suggests some form of leadership. Importantly, this leadership need not have been political in the later state-based sense. Authority may have been situational or ritual, emerging during construction events rather than institutionalized year-round. Skilled artisans, ritual specialists, or respected elders could have directed activities without forming permanent hierarchical classes. The absence of agricultural surplus challenges earlier assumptions that hierarchy depends on farming economies. At Göbekli Tepe, large-scale cooperative labor occurred within a predominantly hunting and gathering framework. This indicates that social complexity can arise in contexts of mobile or semi-sedentary lifeways, provided that shared symbolic systems motivate collective effort. Monumental construction at Göbekli Tepe therefore demonstrates that organized labor, logistical planning, and coordinated leadership preceded permanent settlement and domesticated agriculture. Leadership may have been ritual rather than political. Authority may have been embedded in ritual knowledge. The architectural and iconographic features of Göbekli Tepe suggest centralized planning and coordinated labor, yet the archaeological record provides limited evidence for permanent social stratification. The uniformity of enclosure layouts, symmetry of T-shaped pillars, and consistency in carved motifs indicate standardization and deliberate design. Such precision implies the presence of individuals or groups capable of overseeing construction and maintaining symbolic conventions. However, excavations have not revealed elite burials, high-status grave goods, or material wealth differentiation within Layer 3 contexts. No skeletal or artifact evidence suggests hereditary privilege. These absences challenge traditional interpretations of social hierarchy based on material markers. Instead, authority may have derived from ritual knowledge, specialized skill, or experience in organizing seasonal labor events rather than permanent political office. Comparative analysis with contemporaneous Pre-Pottery Neolithic (PPNA) sites reinforces this interpretation. Similar architectural practices and symbolic motifs at sites, such as Navali Kori and Karahan Tepe, indicate increasing symbolic cohesion across the region. Shared ritual conventions could have served as a mechanism for social regulation and cooperative behavior without formal hierarchy. The emphasis on ritual authority aligns with seasonal aggregation models. Individuals recognized for expertise in symbolic knowledge, construction techniques, or ceremonial leadership may have coordinated labor and structured events during peak occupation periods. Such authority was likely situational, emerging in response to collective needs for ritual observance and monument construction, rather than codified as permanent social stratification. Göbekli Tepe's organization demonstrates that social complexity and coordinated labor do not necessitate hereditary elites or permanent settlement. Authority can operate through symbolic and ritual frameworks, mobilizing human resources efficiently while maintaining egalitarian residential patterns elsewhere. Göbekli Tepe did not exist in isolation. The ritual network extended beyond a single hilltop. Archaeological evidence situates Göbekli Tepe within a network of pre-pottery Neolithic sites across Upper Mesopotamia. Lithic sourcing demonstrates the movement of obsidian from eastern Anatolia, suggesting long-distance exchange relationships. Obsidian blades, cores, and fragments recovered at the site match geochemical signatures of sources over 200 kilometers distant. These materials imply that construction and ritual activities were supported by interregional procurement systems. Architectural parallels further reinforce regional connections. T-shaped pillars, characteristic of Göbekli Tepe, appear at Karahan Tepe, Navali Kori, and other contemporaneous sites. Relief styles, pillar orientations, and enclosure layouts reveal a shared symbolic vocabulary maintained across multiple communities. The replication of such monumental forms suggests a cultural koine, an overarching ritual framework fostering cohesion and communication across dispersed settlements. The construction of monumental architecture likely required not only raw materials but knowledge transfer. Techniques for quarrying, carving, transporting, and erecting multi-ton pillars were transmitted between sites, implying intergroup contact and collaboration. The repetition of architectural and iconographic motifs indicates that these interactions included formalized ritual instruction as well as practical engineering knowledge. Seasonal aggregation events may have facilitated these exchanges. Communities could convene at central sites to share symbolic practices, coordinate labor, and distribute materials. Obsidian movement, pillar replication, and stylistic consistency collectively suggest that these networks were active during the PPNA-PPNB transition, supporting both social and ritual cohesion. Socially, these regional networks may have reinforced authority structures based on ritual expertise. Leaders or specialists in one community could influence practices at neighboring sites, ensuring continuity in symbolic systems. The absence of permanent hierarchical markers in any single settlement indicates that influence was exercised through shared tradition and coordinated labor rather than coercion. The evidence highlights the scale and complexity of pre-agricultural cooperation. Interregional networks allowed mobile hunter-gatherer communities to participate in monumental projects, maintain symbolic coherence, and facilitate material exchange over distances exceeding 100 kilometers. Such networks demonstrate that early Neolithic societies possessed the organizational capacity to integrate ritual, labor, and economy across a broad geographic area. These networks coincided with broader economic transformation, linking resource procurement, seasonal gatherings, and monumental construction. They set the stage for evolving settlement patterns, symbolic standardization, and eventual steps toward domestication. Göbekli Tepe was part of a wider ceremonial landscape. Approximately 35 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe lies Karahan Tepe, a site exhibiting similar T-shaped pillars and carved reliefs. Excavation has revealed circular enclosures reminiscent of those at Göbekli Tepe, suggesting continuity in architectural tradition. Radiocarbon dates from Karahan Tepe align closely with early PPNA phases of Göbekli Tepe, confirming contemporaneity. The stylistic and structural parallels are striking. Central pillars at Karahan Tepe mirror the anthropomorphic features observed in Göbekli Tepe, including abstract arms, belts, and fox pelt motifs. Surrounding perimeter pillars exhibit similar predatory and symbolic carvings. The replication of design elements across sites suggests that early communities shared a ritual vocabulary, extending beyond isolated construction projects. The presence of multiple sites with comparable monumental architecture indicates that ceremonial landscapes in Upper Mesopotamia were regionally integrated. Architectural, iconographic, and spatial consistency imply that symbolic traditions and labor techniques were disseminated among groups occupying the Fertile Crescent. This regional framework likely facilitated shared ritual norms, labor organization, and the circulation of material goods such as obsidian. These parallels demonstrate that Göbekli Tepe did not represent an isolated innovation but was embedded within a network of cooperative cultural production. Communities participated in coordinated monument building and ritual observance, maintaining standardized symbolic systems across significant distances. The convergence of construction practices, iconography, and dating provides compelling evidence for an early Neolithic ceremonial complex operating at a regional scale. Exchange networks facilitated shared symbolic systems. Stone tools reveal ancient trade routes. Analytical sourcing of lithic materials at Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that communities were actively engaged in long-distance exchange well before the emergence of urban centers. Geochemical analysis of obsidian artifacts indicates that the majority originated from volcanic sources in the Cappadocian region, located more than 300 kilometers to the east. This finding confirms that raw materials were transported across considerable distances, connecting disparate pre-pottery Neolithic (PPNA) groups throughout Upper Mesopotamia. Obsidian blades, cores, and flakes appear in multiple excavation contexts, from tool-making debris to ceremonial deposits within enclosures. The consistent presence of this non-local material suggests that procurement was organized rather than incidental. Groups may have acquired obsidian through direct travel, intergroup exchange, or seasonal gatherings, implying an early system of interregional connectivity. The logistical demands of transporting obsidian over hundreds of kilometers indicate coordinated effort and planning. Unlike locally available flint or limestone, obsidian was valued for its superior knappability, producing exceptionally sharp cutting edges. Its circulation highlights both technological preference and social mechanisms for distribution, revealing networks that integrated resource acquisition with ritual and subsistence practices. The use of Cappadocian obsidian at Göbekli Tepe predates established urban trade by several millennia, demonstrating that complex intergroup relationships existed among mobile or semi-sedentary communities. Such networks facilitated not only the movement of materials but also the transmission of symbolic and architectural knowledge, as evidenced by the standardized T-pillars observed across multiple sites, including Karahan Tepe and Navali Kori. Obsidian artifacts also serve as chronological markers, corroborating radiocarbon sequences from associated construction layers. Their presence in Layer 3 contexts confirms that long-distance exchange was contemporaneous with the earliest monumental phase, linking raw material procurement with communal labor and ritual activity. These networks likely supported broader socioeconomic strategies. By connecting multiple communities, obsidian exchange may have reinforced cooperation, facilitated labor mobilization, and contributed to the maintenance of symbolic cohesion across Upper Mesopotamia. The circulation of high-quality stone enabled both practical tool production and ritual deposition, embedding interregional connectivity into daily and ceremonial life. As networks expanded, subsistence patterns evolved. Monumentality did not begin with cities. The monumental enclosures of Göbekli Tepe radically alter conventional narratives regarding the origins of large-scale architecture. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest constructions at approximately 9,600 BCE, making them roughly 6 millennia older than Stonehenge and more than 7 millennia older than the Egyptian pyramids. This temporal precedence situates Göbekli Tepe firmly in a period dominated by mobile hunter-gatherer communities, rather than sedentary urban populations. Traditional models of social evolution have long assumed that monumental architecture arose as a consequence of settled agricultural economies, which could produce surplus labor and resources to support large-scale construction. Göbekli Tepe challenges this framework by demonstrating that complex symbolic and architectural projects could emerge in pre-agricultural societies. The organization of labor, procurement of raw materials, and standardization of ritual forms indicate sophisticated social coordination independent of domesticated food production. The scale and abstraction of the T-shaped pillars further underscore the symbolic intent of these early structures. Anthropomorphic representations, animal reliefs, and uniform enclosure layouts convey ritual and cosmological meaning, revealing that pre-urban communities engaged in long-term planning and shared ideological frameworks. Monumentality in this context appears to have been motivated by ritual and social cohesion rather than economic hierarchy. Archaeological interpretations now consider the possibility that the construction of Göbekli Tepe may have stimulated subsequent developments in plant domestication. Seasonal gatherings, cooperative labor, and centralized feasting could have created pressures and incentives for more predictable food production. In this way, monumentality precedes agriculture, reversing earlier assumptions that sedentism and domestication were prerequisites for large-scale architecture. The site also informs comparative studies of early Neolithic networks. Parallels with Karahan Tepe, Navali Kori, and other PPNB sites highlight that monumental construction was part of a broader regional phenomenon, integrating labor, symbolic practice, and long-distance exchange. Such evidence situates Göbekli Tepe as a foundational example of early ceremonial landscapes across Upper Mesopotamia. By reframing the origins of monumental architecture, Göbekli Tepe has prompted a reassessment of social evolution. It demonstrates that symbolic complexity, coordinated labor, and architectural ambition emerged prior to cities, states, and formalized agricultural economies. Its reinterpretation continues to influence modern scholarship, challenging assumptions about the sequence of technological, social, and ideological development in early human history. Its reinterpretation continues in modern scholarship. Modern recognition reflects its global significance. In 2018, Göbekli Tepe was formally inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, acknowledging its unparalleled contribution to understanding the origins of human civilization. The designation highlights both its archaeological significance and the urgent need for preservation, situating the site within a global framework of heritage management. Recognition by UNESCO underscores Göbekli Tepe's role not merely as a regional curiosity, but as a cornerstone in the study of early Neolithic society, monumentality, and ritual expression. Ongoing excavations are conducted under the supervision of Turkish authorities, in collaboration with international research teams. These projects continue to document, conserve, and interpret the monumental enclosures. Excavators employ stratigraphic recording, 3D photogrammetry, and GIS mapping to capture architectural and artifact data with precision. Conservation efforts include stabilizing exposed pillars, protecting reliefs from weathering, and implementing controlled visitor pathways to minimize site degradation. Such practices ensure both the longevity of the material record and accessibility for continued scholarly study. Archaeological management balances excavation with preservation. Many enclosures remain buried under soil intentionally left in situ to reduce erosion and environmental damage. Protective shelters cover exposed monuments, while detailed digital documentation allows researchers to analyze features without risking structural integrity. These measures reflect a growing emphasis on sustainable heritage management, integrating scientific inquiry with conservation principles. UNESCO recognition has also facilitated broader engagement with the public and academic communities. The site serves as a locus for international conferences, collaborative publications, and interdisciplinary research on early Neolithic society. By providing standardized frameworks for documentation and reporting, the designation enhances comparative studies with other pre-pottery Neolithic sites, strengthening our understanding of regional networks, labor organization, and symbolic systems. Göbekli Tepe's preservation initiatives demonstrate how contemporary scholarship and heritage management intersect. Archaeologists can continue to refine chronological frameworks, analyze material culture, and investigate subsistence strategies, while safeguarding the monumental structures for future generations. The global significance of the site ensures that it remains both a center for scientific discovery and a symbol of humanity's early cultural achievements. Much remains beneath the soil. Before we continue exploring the mysteries buried beneath Göbekli Tepe, make sure to hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon to get the daily Nightfall history video. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Göbekli Tepe fascinates you the most? Your engagement helps us bring more deep dives into history straight to your screen.